Hello. We're still learning lessons from the life of David. Today we're going to be talking about David and Goliath. Even people who have never set a foot in church have heard this mismatched story about a gutsy little guy and an indestructible big guy. We started learning about David and Goliath in Sunday school, and many of us even think it's still a kid's story. When I was looking for some pictures for my PowerPoint, I thought, that's really something. All of the pictures have to do with David and Goliath from a kid's perspective. But the problem is, this was not a G-rated event. It's easy to look at this story and think about a young boy and a warrior giant, Davy's puny sling, against a warrior who has state-of-the-art equipment, but that's not the point. There are real-life adult lessons to be learned. The story behind the giant is about seeing life from God's perspective and acting in faith on that. David did overcome the giant, and what he did will teach us lessons that we need to know to fight our own giants, because we still have them. Lesson number 1. The last time that we learned about David, he had come to the battlefield to get news for his dad about what was happening with his brothers. While there, he heard Goliath defy the armies of Israel, and more than that, defy their God. Well, David said, I'll go fight. Others said he couldn't. His older brother Eliab said he shouldn't fight. And King Saul said, I'll tell you how to fight. The problem is, none of those worked for David. We must learn how to fight our own spiritual battles. What has worked for other people may not work for us. God will give us the ability to fight the battles that we should fight. We can't listen when people say you can't, you shouldn't, or this is how you can do it. Our lesson today is that the battle before we even get into the battle will be to listen to our spirit and what God is saying to us rather than what everyone around us is saying. Only God's opinion really matters. Secondly, he heard that God mocking Israel and their God, and so he persuaded King David to let him fight. But he decided not to wear he persuaded King Saul to let him fight. He decided not to wear any of Saul's armor. You see, Saul looked like the enemy. He had the helmet like the enemy. He had brass armor. He had a long spear. What did David had? David had 5 little stones and a slingshot. But that's not as bad as it sounds, because in those days, a sling with a stone could become a lethal weapon in the right hands. And David had spent years in the sheepfold, protecting those sheep, learning how to use that sling with complete accuracy. You see, we don't have to look like the enemy, dress like the enemy, or fight like the enemy to win. God will help us to be ourselves and who he has called us to be. Third lesson is from 1 Samuel 17:40. Then he, David, took his staff in his hands, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag and a pouch which he had, and his sling which was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistines. Well, David was comfortable with that simple sling and a weapon that he was skilled in using. God has given you a lot of techniques. God has given you a lot of gifts and talents. And the simple sling, the 5 stones, they didn't look like much. But because they were what God had given David, what God had placed within his hands. They were exactly what he needed to win the battle in that situation. Be yourself. Use the talents and the gifts that God has already given you. David used what was available. He fought that huge giant and he won. If God has not given it to you, he will not demand it of you. Then, number 4, we see David was just a baby in comparison to the size of Goliath. 9 feet, 6 inches. That's pretty tall. All the others had run away in fear because they were smaller. Oh, they weren't just smaller in size because all the Israelites that day were only about halfway, but they were smaller in their own sight because of their fear. When the Israelites, many hundreds of years ago, had first looked at the promised land, they said there were giants in the land, and we were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so we became in our own. And that's what had happened to the children of Israel. They became grasshoppers. They became little bitty babies in their own eyes because of the size of Goliath, because of his abilities and because of everything that they had heard about him. But David would not let that stop him. He says, you might be big, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. He knew where his power was, and it wasn't in his size. David overcame his natural fear to face the giants because he knew that his God was bigger than any giant and that he could give him the entire Philistine army. David's boldness came from his absolute faith in God. And in that faith, David began to run through the giant. Rely on the size of the Lord instead of fearing the size of the enemy. Lesson number 5 we can learn from 1 Samuel 17:41. The Philistines came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. No, we often overlook this. When we see pictures of David and Goliath, very few picture that shield bearer. And most of the ones that do will have David here, Goliath here, but the shield bearer way over to the side. No, that shield bearer went right in front of Goliath. And as David was running toward Goliath, the shield bearer came first. But Goliath towered in the background higher than him. Now, David had a choice. If he kept running, he was going to meet that shield bearer first. And it would have been very easy to take him out. Yeah, and say, there's one down. Because the shield bearer was definitely an enemy of Israel. And a lot of times we face enemies, but they're not the real enemy. And if David had taken time to take out that first insignificant, that first small enemy, what would have happened? He would have had to stop, take out another stone, reload it, and swing again. And he probably would not have had time to do that. We need to keep our eye on the target and realize we don't have to fight every enemy. We need to learn how to pick our battles and not be distracted from the real enemy. Lesson number 6. Also in the same chapter, verses 45 and 46, David said to the Philistines, "You come to me with a sword and with a shield and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. So that, because of this, all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David knew that this was much more than just a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. He knew that there was more at stake than the reward. The reward was getting the king's daughter. The daughter was cash, without taxes. Yeah, all of that sounds great, but he knew it was even more than that. David knew that it was more than making a name for himself by letting his brothers know that he was no longer the baby in the family, but he was somebody that they could look up to. David knew that it was more than just being able to say, yes, I have been anointed king of Israel, and I'm walking into my destiny. He knew that the real battle was that everyone might know that there is a God in Israel. Let me tell you, that's why we're fighting. We're fighting that everybody might know that Jesus is Lord, that there is a God, and that the same God who saw David through, the same God who gave David the victory, is the same God that is with us today and will give us victory in every situation. We have to remember that, and that's so important to know why you are fighting. And then, lesson number 7. David ran and stood over the Philistine. He took his sword and drew it out of the sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he took his armor and put it in his tent. As David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. He said, oh, that's gory. Yeah, that's why this is not a G-rated story. It really happened. David cut the head off. He cut Goliath's head off using the giant's own sword, and then he carried that bloody head around all the way from the battlefield back to his tent in Jerusalem. And then from there, he carried it right to the king. King Saul saw it. Goliath was not just a name, it was a title that meant the beheader, to behead ruthlessly. And that's exactly what David did to him. He beheaded him ruthlessly. You see, this came down to Goliath's head, or David's destiny. David stood and heard the giant defy Israel and God. He said, I will fight. He went on the battlefield. He took the stones, but the battle was not won until David took the life of the giant. And this is so true for us. No matter how bad or how harsh it sounds, either we deal with the giant and destroy it, or that giant will take us out and destroy our destiny. We have to be willing to get our hands bloody sometimes. We have to be willing to do the bad stuff, knowing that we have to take out our enemy. Then, lesson 8. David comes within range, and he places a stone in the sling, and he puts it up, and the whirring sound sounds, and when it gets just to the right noise and the right speed, he lets that stone fly, and it goes probably about 100 miles an hour and lands right in Goliath's head. The giant is dead probably before he even hits the ground. But when the Philistines saw that their giant was dead, and this is what it was all about, what did they do? They ran. They went back to their camps. They fled. They put up what little fight they had left in them. But 1 Samuel 17, verse 9, when Goliath came out every morning And every evening for 40 days, he made this same statement. He challenged the people of Israel. And he was speaking on behalf of his king and his nation when he said, you send someone to fight me, and we will fight. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. Let me tell you, that didn't happen. Even without their giant, even without their champion Goliath, the Philistines weren't ready to give up. The battle with the Philistines, even though they did not have Goliath, continued throughout the reign of Saul. And this is our lesson here. Your enemy, Satan, is a liar, and he will never quit fighting. Do not believe his promises. He wants you to give up. He wants you to stop fighting. He wants to use you in any way he can. But he's nothing but a liar. And no matter what he promises you, how good he says your life will be, don't believe him. He is a liar who will never stop fighting you. Finally, Goliath still challenges us today. Oh, I know we're not on the Philistine battleground, and we don't see a person 9 feet, 6 feet tall wearing 142 pounds of body armor. No, but what we face is real. Some of the things we face may be unseen. Maybe it's unforgiveness, hatred, envy, fear. Maybe there are things that other people have done to us that have caused hurts, disappointments. Maybe we're going through a real struggle with sickness, financial loss. All of these are giants that are just as individual as we are. And every trial, every hurt, every temptation, every sin facing us. And unless we, like David, fight our giant, face our giant, and remove our giant, this enemy, whatever or whoever it might be, will come to destroy us. See, our battle is not against flesh and blood. And David realized that. David says, I come to you in the name of the Lord. He recognized that, yes, this giant was big, and he could see him, and he was over 9 feet tall. But what he was fighting was a spirit that was out to destroy him, out to destroy his people, his family, in the name of his God. That's what we're fighting today. But there are two lessons that we have to learn from David, two real truths. The truths are that the Lord is with us. God is with us no matter what. No matter how bad the situation is, no matter how big our giant is, God is there with us, and it's not our fight any longer. The battle is the Lord's. David saw that. He recognized that. And once we understand that, all of a sudden, the odds shift in our favor. It's no longer a fair fight for the enemy. You see, Roy Hicks Jr. years and years ago said that the devil is a street fighter. He does not fight fair. And that's the truth. But with God on our side, we have to know that it doesn't matter how he fights. We are more than conquerors. We can have the victory in every situation. We can overcome just like David did. A huge giant is nothing in comparison with God. Giant Goliath, who terrorized the entire Israelite army, fell at the hands of an inexperienced youth. And whatever giant you're facing, that same God who saw David through, who gave him the victory, is with you. This faith prove that there was a God in Israel. And the God who gave the victory to David will do the same for you today. Our lesson is, through faith in God, you can defeat your giants. God wants you to know that He is with you. He will see you through. He will give you the strength that you need for every giant that you face. He wants to make you victorious. Trust in Him and act on that faith. That's what He wants you to know, and that's how He wants you to act. Be strong in the power of the Lord and in His might, not yours.